The wind screamed across the frozen market square, carrying flakes of razor-edged ice that stung like needles against exposed skin. Lights flickered along the abandoned stalls, their glow struggling to pierce through the blizzard that blanketed everything in white. Doors rattled. Metal signs creaked. The entire settlement felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass or for someone unfortunate enough to be caught outside to succumb to it. In that brutal silence, a small shape lay curled near the steps of a shuttered vendor's booth, her tiny form shivering violently as snow piled over her limbs. She tried to move, but every twitch sent pain rippling down her spine. Her fingers, thin and translucent, were already turning a dull gray, the first sign her species' fragile circulatory system was failing under the cold. She had been pushed out less than an hour ago. Thrown outside with a single phrase spoken without emotion. Resource drain removed. No one looked back. No one cared. Survival of the useful, that was the way her colony governed itself. Children who were weak, sick, or developing too slowly were simply left outside when the temperature dropped enough to make their bodies shut down quickly. It was considered practical. Efficient. Clean. She had known the rules, even at her young age, but knowing them didn't make the cold any kinder. Her body curled tighter, instinctively trying to protect vital organs. Her breath came in thin, uneven wisps, each one weaker than the last. A pair of aliens walked past her, their heavy coats flapping in the wind. One glanced her way, then quickly looked forward again. They kept moving. Another passerby stepped around her, muttering something about inconvenience. No one stopped. No one even slowed. The storm swallowed her soft cry for help before it reached anyone's ears. She tried again, a whisper only inches long, but her voice cracked into silence. Her eyelids drooped. Darkness pressed in, slow and suffocating. She wondered how long freezing took. She wondered if pain eventually faded or if she would feel this sharp agony until the very end. Her species didn't have legends or comforting beliefs. There was no afterlife, just the cold. Snow piled over her shoulder. Her breathing stuttered. She felt her heartbeat slowing. Faintly, she thought she heard footsteps, different ones, heavier, steady, dragging slightly as if their owner pushed through deep snow with stubborn determination. She didn't lift her head. She didn't have the strength. The last thing she expected was for the steps to stop right beside her. A shadow crouched. A gloved hand brushed away the snow covering her face. Warmth, actual warmth, spread from the gloved fingers into her cheek. She forced her eyes open. A human. His breath fogged in front of him, jacket frosted around the shoulders from walking through the storm. His brows were drawn as he studied her, not with disgust or annoyance, but with concern. Real, unmistakable concern. He touched her wrist gently, checking her pulse, his expression tightening at how weak it was. Humans weren't common in this region of the moon. Most found the climate miserable and the local culture even worse. But this one didn't hesitate. He didn't question why a child was lying half buried in snow alone during a blizzard. He didn't assume she deserved it. He simply acted. "Hey," he said quietly, voice low and steady, letting her hear the warmth instead of the storm. "Stay with me." She tried to respond, but only a faint sound escaped. He didn't waste a second. He pulled off his insulated outer layer, a heavy human-engineered coat designed to retain heat even in sub-zero temperatures, and wrapped it carefully around her body. The sudden warmth shocked her system. She gasped, twitching weakly, but he held her securely, shielding her from the wind with his own frame. He lifted her into his arms, her weight almost nothing, as if she were made of delicate glass. The moment he stood, the storm slammed against them with renewed force. Ice laden wind tore at his clothing, howling past his ears. He leaned forward and started walking, steps wide and deliberate, keeping his body between her and the harshest gusts. She felt the vibrations of his heartbeat through his chest, strong and rhythmic, completely different from her fading, fragile pulse. She clung weakly to the fabric of his jacket, her fingers barely curling but instinctively seeking stability. He adjusted his hold so she wouldn't slip. As he pushed through the snow, Lights from distant buildings flickered through the white haze. He walked past aliens who stared at him with shocked expressions. Some whispered among themselves, surprised and confused at the sight. A human carrying an abandoned child home instead of stepping around her like everyone else had. But no one tried to stop him. They simply watched with the same baffled disbelief that humans had long learned to ignore. The storm intensified, snow sweeping across the path so thickly he could barely see. But he didn't slow. He didn't falter. Each step was deliberate and powerful. He was breathing harder now from the effort, but he kept going, refusing to let her body cool any further. Her head rested against his shoulder, her vision swimming, but she stayed conscious enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. It was the first real warmth she had felt since she was forced outside. It felt unreal. Like something forbidden. Her species taught that humans were unpredictable, emotional, and overly protective of the weak, qualities viewed as liabilities. But none of those beliefs prepared her for the raw determination she now witnessed firsthand. This human would not abandon her. Not in the snow, not to the cold, not even if the world demanded it. His grip on her tightened gently each time the wind threatened to pull her from his arms. His steps never staggered, even when he hit uneven ground. He moved as if carrying her mattered more than the storm, more than policy, more than anything. The dome where he lived came into view through the blizzard, a faint glow under layers of frost. He reached the door, slammed his hand against the scanner, and the metal plates unlocked with a hiss of warm air. Heat washed over them immediately as he stepped inside, shielding her from the sudden temperature change. The door sealed behind him, blocking out the howling wind. The interior lights brightened, revealing a compact but well-maintained habitat filled with warmth and breathable air. He lowered her gently onto a thermal blanket near the heater, unwrapped the coat, and checked her pulse again. His lips pressed into a thin line at how slow it still was. He activated a warming unit, placed heated packs around her limbs, and covered her with multiple layers. She flinched from the sudden warmth, trembling uncontrollably as her body tried to recover, but he remained there beside her, one hand lightly resting near her shoulder so she knew she wasn't alone. "Don't fade," he murmured, voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. "You're safe now. I've got you." For the first time since she'd been thrown out, she believed it. Warmth filled the small dome, slowly fighting the deep cold embedded in the child's body. The heater hummed steadily, casting soft amber light across the floor. The human worked quickly, moving with a practiced calm that came from experience, not panic. He reached for a medkit designed for cross-species emergencies, flipping it open with one hand while checking her breathing with the other. Her chest rose only slightly, uneven and shallow, but she was alive. That alone was enough for him to push harder. He retrieved a packet of warming gel, activating it with a snap. It glowed faintly as its temperature climbed, and he gently applied it along the child's arms and neck, careful not to shock her system. She twitched, letting out a faint cry, but she didn't pull away. Her senses were too numb for fear, too drained for resistance. She only knew that his hands weren't hurting her. They were giving heat, not taking anything away. Her eyes fluttered open once, barely focused, the irises a soft green that shifted under the heater's glow. She saw the human's outline and tried to speak, but her throat produced only a strained whimper. He leaned closer, understanding without needing words. "Don't force it," he murmured. "Just breathe. You're safe." Safe. It was a word she had never heard used for her. Safety didn't apply to children like her in this colony. She was considered weak, a burden, a miscalculation in biological output. She had been shown her place since she could remember, useful or disposable. And when the cold season arrived, the colony chose what they believed was efficient. But this human, this stranger, had lifted her from the snow without hesitation. He had carried her through the storm like her life mattered more than the weather, more than rules, more than risk. She didn't understand why. She didn't know what to do with the confusion that swelled inside her, mixing fear, warmth, and disbelief into something she had no word for. He reached for a hydration tube, warmed it, and helped her sip a few drops of mineral-infused liquid that her species could digest. Her throat struggled at first, then accepted it. Bit by bit, she felt warmth spread deeper into her chest, as if her frozen heart began to remember its purpose. Outside, the wind still clawed at the dome walls, rattling them under the storm's weight. The human listened for a moment, assessing whether the storm had worsened. It had. He didn't like that. He knew storms on this moon were dangerous, but not as dangerous as the authorities who enforced the colony's rules. He didn't voice the fear forming quietly in his mind, but the tension in his shoulders revealed enough. Helping her wasn't just a risk, it was a violation. Saving an abandoned juvenile was classified as interference with natural selection protocols. Penalties were severe. He didn't care. He reached for a towel and dried the melting snow from her hair, working gently so he wouldn't damage the delicate strands. She watched him with tired, confused eyes, trying to understand this strange species that acted out of pure instinct to protect. Humans had been labeled emotional, impulsive, and too attached to their moral codes. She had heard adults mock them. Humans waste resources on empathy. Yet here she was, alive only because a human refused to walk away. She attempted again to form words, her voice cracking out a whisper. "You shouldn't." He shook his head before she could finish. "Let them complain. You'll get in trouble," she managed, her voice thin as frost. "I've been in trouble before," he said, a faint, almost amused exhale escaping him. "Trouble is survivable. Freezing isn't." She didn't understand how he could speak so simply about a risk that terrified everyone else. His species lived by a code that puzzled her colony: no child left behind. It wasn't practical. It wasn't efficient. Yet here, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by warmth she never thought she'd feel again, she wondered how something so impractical could feel so right. He checked her vitals again. Her temperature was rising steadily now, her pulse stronger. She would live, if she stayed warm and hydrated. Good. That meant the real danger would come next. The dome's communicator beeped sharply, its tone urgent and cold. The human stiffened. He stood, walked to the panel, and tapped the screen. A holographic symbol appeared, representing the local council. It flickered, then resolved into a flat, synthetic voice. "Human resident Evan Hale," the voice said, unbothered by the wind roaring outside. "We have detected the unauthorized retrieval of a discarded juvenile from the designated abandonment zone." The child's breath hitched. She curled tighter under the blanket, as if the voice itself could drag her away. Evan's jaw tightened. "I didn't retrieve anything unauthorized. I rescued a child who was freezing to death. That action is classified as interference," the council replied. "Surrender the juvenile immediately for proper disposal protocols." He didn't answer at first. He stared at the panel, expression unreadable, then shut the communicator off with a single decisive tap. The voice cut off instantly. The dome returned to silence except for the heater's hum. The child stared at him with wide eyes. No one ever cut off the council's voice. Not unless they were prepared to face consequences that never ended well. "You shouldn't do that," she whispered. "They'll come." "I know," he said simply. "I'm not worth it." The words slipped out before she could stop them, words she had heard her whole life. Words her mind had accepted long before her body gave out in the snow. She expected him to correct her gently, like adults sometimes did when they wanted to soften cruelty. But his reaction was immediate and fierce. "Don't say that again," he said, kneeling beside her. "You're worth saving because you're alive. That's enough." She stared at him, trying to process the idea. Worth saving. Her. The words didn't make sense in her world. But they made sense in his. He placed fresh heating pads around her, adjusting them carefully. Her trembling was finally slowing, her breathing deepening. Her body was winning against the cold. For the first time since she was pushed outside, her chest no longer felt like it was collapsing inward. Evan walked to the supply cabinet and pulled out insulated panels, reinforcing the dome entrance. He moved with determination, not fear. He knew the council. He knew they wouldn't leave the matter alone. But he also knew something else. Humans weren't easily intimidated. Not when it came to protecting life. The child watched him work, her eyelids heavy but her mind buzzing. He was preparing for something. Something big. Something she wasn't sure she wanted him to face on her behalf. But as warmth finally settled deep into her bones and her heartbeat steadied, another thought formed slowly, quietly, in a place inside her she didn't know existed. Maybe she was worth saving. Even if only because one human believed she was. Under the bitter glow of the station's outer lamps, the storm kept punching waves of frozen dust across the landing tiers, each blast sharper than the last. Evan pushed through it with his coat wrapped tight, boots crunching hard against ice. He just finished a long shift repairing cargo loaders and only wanted the burning comfort of his apartment heater. But something small and curled near a supply crate made him stop. At first he thought it was debris or a shed tarp, but then the mound shivered. A thin, trembling sound leaked out, barely audible over the wind. When he stepped closer, the shape flinched, as if expecting a blow. The storm carved sideways across her tiny frame, the cold eating through what little she had, a torn cloak, bare hands, no thermal mesh. She couldn't have been older than a young teen by alien years, and her skin, a pale violet tone, was mottled with frostbite. He crouched, palms open so she wouldn't startle. She stared back, eyes too big for her face, glowing dull instead of bright like her species normally showed. The girl didn't speak, only curled tighter as though the storm might swallow her whole. Evan reached out, and she jerked back, expecting harm. That reaction told him everything. She hadn't just been abandoned, she'd been hurt long before the cold found her. He lowered his voice, soft but firm, letting the tone carry reassurance. Humans weren't common out here on the fringe, and their height alone made some species uneasy, but he kept his posture small and steady. She watched every movement with fear sharpened by exhaustion. A gust slammed into the platform, flinging stinging ice, and she cried out as the cold bit deeper. Evan didn't hesitate this time. He shrugged off his insulated coat and wrapped it around her before she could resist. She tried to push it off, hands weak and shaking, whispering something in her native tongue. He didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. She thought she had no right to warmth. Gently, he placed a hand on her shoulder, not gripping, just grounding her. The contact made her freeze, then slowly relax, tension draining as if no one had touched her kindly in a long time. Her limbs trembled uncontrollably now, late-stage cold exposure. If he didn't get her inside within minutes, she would lose more than feeling in her fingers. He lifted her carefully, and she was frighteningly light, weightless like someone who hadn't eaten properly for days. She didn't resist the way most frightened aliens did when picked up by a human. Instead, she sagged, too tired to fight, too scared to ask why he cared. Her head rested against his shoulder, breaths uneven and shallow. He shielded her from the wind with his body as he made his way through the empty service corridor toward the residential levels. The old metal hallway groaned from the storm's pressure, lights flickering overhead. Halfway down the hall, she tried to speak again, her voice broken and thin. He shook his head gently. "Save your strength," he murmured, adjusting his grip so her face stayed warm against the coat lining. Her fingers clung to the fabric, unsure but desperate. Every step made him more aware of the violence done to her long before the cold set in. Bruises hidden beneath frost, cuts that hadn't been treated, signs of neglect no child should bear. She whimpered when the heating mist from the inner doors brushed her skin, like warmth itself frightened her. When he entered his apartment, the warmth hit them instantly. She flinched at the change, curling tighter as if expecting pain. Evan moved slowly, setting her near the small heater. Steam rose from the coat as ice melted, dripping onto his floor. He fetched blankets, thermal packs, and warm water, placing everything within her reach but not overwhelming her. Her eyes tracked each item cautiously, still unsure if this was safety or another trick. When he offered her the cup, she reached out, stopped midway, then pulled her hand back. Only when he placed it gently near her fingers and stepped away did she finally touch it. Her first sip made her gasp, as if warmth inside her body was an unfamiliar sensation. Evan watched carefully, making sure she didn't drink too fast. At her pace, she slowly unclenched, arms untucking from around herself. Her skin tone flickered faintly, her species' biological sign that she was stabilizing. The tension didn't vanish, but something new replaced it, the first flicker of trust. She glanced at him with a hesitant, questioning look, as if struggling to understand why a human, one of the so-called dangerous species, would help a stranger left in the cold. Evan didn't speak much. He knew forcing conversation would only push her deeper into her shell. Instead, he sat a respectful distance away, letting his presence be calm, steady, predictable. Every so often she looked up, checking if he was still there. Humans had a reputation across the fringe for being stubborn protectors, fierce when needed but oddly gentle with the vulnerable. Watching her inch closer to the heater, letting warmth soften her rigid posture, he felt that familiar human stubbornness rising. Whoever left her out there wasn't getting her back. Not now, not ever. She finally whispered a word, her name, barely breathed. Evan repeated it softly so she'd know he'd heard. Her shoulders loosened, and the faint glow in her eyes grew just a shade brighter. In that small, fragile moment, she understood something powerful. She wasn't going to freeze, and she wasn't alone. The galaxy feared humans because of what they could destroy. They should have remembered what humans saved. Evan barely slept that night, not because he was uncomfortable, but because every few minutes he found himself checking on the girl curled on the mattress he'd set beside the heater. Her breathing had steadied, but the way she jolted at every distant clang of the station's metal walls showed how deep her fear ran. He didn't touch her or move too close, just stayed alert, making sure she didn't slip back into the cold she'd escaped. When morning light filtered through the thin blinds, she was already half awake, blinking at the unfamiliar safety around her as if she expected it to vanish. Her hands gripped the blanket, not with fear this time, but with uncertainty, as though she didn't quite know what she was allowed to hold on to. When he handed her a small bowl of warm food, she hesitated the same way she had with the water, reaching, stopping, pulling back, as if waiting to be punished for wanting something. He placed the bowl within reach and stepped away. Slowly, her fingers moved again, trembling, and she took the first bite. The way her shoulders shuddered made him wonder how long it had been since she'd eaten anything real. She ate quietly, eyes darting between the door and him, expecting some interruption that would snatch survival away from her. But nothing happened. No one shouted, no one dragged her back outside. She finished every crumb, then held the bowl in her lap like it was something precious. The station outside his apartment window buzzed with distant activity. Morning crowds, heavy machinery, the usual chaos of life on the fringe. But Evan knew something else was brewing. A child abandoned in freezing conditions wasn't just cruelty. Someone wanted her gone. Dead or disappeared, it didn't matter which. And if those people realized she hadn't died in the cold, they would start looking for her. He needed to find out who she belonged to, who had mistreated her, and why. But he also had to earn her trust before pushing her into any conversation that might reopen wounds he didn't yet understand. She watched him as he packed the items from last night, folding the blankets, resetting the heater. Every time he moved, her eyes tracked him with frightened precision. He made a mental note to soften his movements, keep everything predictable. Humans were big compared to most species here, and although he was trying to be gentle, he knew even a simple gesture could look intimidating. So he slowed down, quiet, calm, steady, letting her see that nothing he did came with hidden intentions. Eventually, her posture changed just slightly, her muscles loosening as she accepted that he wasn't masking harm behind kindness. He knelt a few feet away from her and spoke softly, telling her she was safe, telling her he wouldn't force her to talk, telling her nothing outside that door could reach her without going through him first. She didn't understand every word, but she recognized tone. It made her inch a little closer, curling the blanket tighter, as if claiming a small piece of space for herself. She said her name again, clearer this time, and he repeated it back carefully, making sure she knew he meant it with respect. Her faint bioluminescent markings responded, glowing a little brighter, a sign of emotional stabilization among her species. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy or fearful. It was cautious, fragile, but growing. She seemed to gather courage before pointing to her wrist, a thin band of bruised skin where some kind of restraint must have been. His jaw tightened involuntarily, and she recoiled at his reaction, misreading it. He quickly softened his expression, murmuring reassurance until she relaxed again. He realized then how deeply her mind was wired to expect anger. Whoever had handled her before had used fear as a leash. He offered her a small translation slate, placing it gently in front of her so she could type or draw if speaking felt too hard. Her fingers hovered over it, hesitant, but then she tapped a symbol. One word appeared on the screen, taken. Then another, property. His entire body tensed, but he kept his face neutral for her sake. A child calling herself property. Someone had broken her long before leaving her to freeze. She typed a third symbol. A location. Evan recognized it. The cargo wastelands near Dock 403, a place where smugglers, slavers, and anyone who wanted to hide something used the shadows to do their dirty work. He felt the familiar burn of human anger rising, not reckless rage, but the cold, precise kind that made humans in the galaxy so feared. When humans got protective, they didn't stop. He closed his fist slowly, turning it away so she wouldn't see the tension, then exhaled to reset his expression. She studied him, expecting him to tell her they couldn't go there or that he would hand her over to station authorities. Instead, he nodded, slow and deliberate, telling her he understood. She didn't know the depth of what that nod meant, the quiet promise, the human vow that whoever had abandoned her would not continue breathing easy. But she sensed something shift. A different kind of certainty filled her posture. Humans had a reputation across the stars for something more dangerous than strength, unshakable loyalty once they claimed someone as theirs to protect. Evan stood, grabbed his jacket, and looked back at her. She clutched the blanket, eyes wide, unsure if he was leaving her behind. He shook his head and extended an open hand, not a command, not a demand, just an invitation. She hesitated only a moment before she reached out and placed her small, trembling hand in his. Her trust was fragile, but it was real. And humans were terrifyingly good at honoring fragile things. He didn't know what waited in Dock 403, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity: whoever had thrown her to the cold had made a fatal mistake. They hadn't expected a human to find her. They hadn't expected humanity's instinct to protect to activate like a weapon. They hadn't expected that the girl they discarded would be carried, shielded, defended by someone who would not back down until she was safe. This time, she wouldn't be the one left in the cold. Evan kept his steps steady and slow so she wouldn't panic, even though every muscle in his body buzzed with the need to move fast. Dock 403 wasn't far, but the path toward it was carved into the darker parts of the station, places where watchers sat behind cracked hollow signs, where illegal trades whispered beneath ventilation grates, and where no one asked questions because the answers were always dangerous. He held her hand lightly, enough for her to feel him there but loose enough for her to pull away if she needed to. Her fingers trembled but didn't let go. That alone hardened his resolve. Every corner they turned gave him more clues. The way she looked at certain door markings with fear, how she shrank at the echo of heavy boots, how she clutched closer when alien voices argued in the distance. She wasn't just afraid of a person, she feared the whole environment around her, as if every metal panel remembered what she had suffered. When they reached the edges of Dock 403, the air changed. It always did here. The lights flickered more, the floor groaned under old machinery, and the atmosphere carried a low, static tension. People who operated in shadows didn't expect sunlight. And right now, Evan was sunlight with fists. A group of dock workers glanced at him, then at the girl hiding behind his arm, and quickly looked away. Humans had a reputation, and he wasn't softening it today. He walked with purpose, scanning the corners until the girl tugged lightly on his sleeve. She pointed toward an old cargo warehouse, its entry door dented and half-lit by a failing sign. Her markings dimmed with dread, but she didn't hide her face. She wanted him to know this was the place. Evan lowered himself slightly so he was eye level with her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder to make sure she understood he wasn't pushing her into danger. He told her she could stay behind him no matter what happened, that nothing inside belonged to her anymore, not her fear, not her past, not the people who hurt her. She exhaled shakily, nodded once, and gripped the back of his jacket as though anchoring herself. Together they stepped inside. The warehouse smelled of chemicals, dust, and something metallic, fears soaked into the walls. Old crates lined the floor, some labeled with trade codes, others completely unmarked. A trio of aliens stood at the far end arguing over a manifest sheet. When they saw Evan walk in, the conversation died instantly. They didn't recognize him, but they recognized the stance, a human prepared for confrontation. One of them narrowed his eyes, scanning the girl behind him. The way her body flinched told Evan everything. These were the ones. The leader stepped forward, arms spreading in a mock-friendly gesture that fooled no one. He began talking, making excuses, claiming misunderstandings, insisting the girl had wandered off, that they'd been looking for her. Lies drenched in the voice of someone who saw children as resources, not people. Evan didn't respond. Humans didn't waste words on those who abandoned kids to freeze. He simply stood, letting the silence grow dense and heavy. The leader shifted uncomfortably under the weight of it. When he tried to move closer, Evan lifted one hand, not a threat, just a boundary, and the alien froze. That single gesture carried the entire reputation of humanity's war history, the stories of humans who tore through battlefields to defend the vulnerable, the tales whispered across colonies about how dangerous human protectiveness could become. The girl peeked from behind Evan, and the moment the leader reached a hand toward her, she recoiled violently, terrified. Evan stepped forward instinctively, placing himself solidly between them. His voice stayed calm but cold when he finally spoke, the kind of tone that didn't rise in volume because it didn't need to. He told them she wasn't property. He told them they weren't taking her anywhere. He told them if they tried to touch her again, the station medics would be pulling broken bones out of their lungs. The aliens stiffened. They hadn't expected that level of certainty. They hadn't expected a human. The leader sneered, muttering that she belonged to them by contract. Contracts didn't matter to someone who had seen a child almost freeze to death. Evan took another step, forcing the alien backward with presence alone. He pointed to her wrist, to the bruises she'd shown him, to the word she'd typed: property. No contract protected torture. No legal code shielded abandonment. And even if it did, no human cared. Two more aliens moved from the shadows, hoping to intimidate. They underestimated how still a human could become when deciding whether or not to fight. Evan didn't raise his fists. He didn't need to. His posture alone told them the truth. If they pushed this, no one here would forget the consequences. A long, thick silence stretched, until the leader finally spat out a curse and stepped back, signaling surrender. They didn't apologize. People like this never did. But they didn't approach again. They knew the girl was lost to them, and that trying to reclaim her would cost more than she was worth to them. Evan didn't waste another breath on them. He turned, crouched beside the girl, and asked softly if she wanted to leave. She nodded hard, tears gathering but not falling. He lifted her gently, not because she was weak, but because she had carried enough weight for a lifetime, and walked out of that warehouse without looking back. Behind them, no one dared follow. As they reached safer corridors, the girl's trembling eased. Her arms slowly loosened where they clung to his neck. She wasn't tense anymore. She was holding on with relief, not fear. Evan felt her small hands curl into the fabric of his jacket with trust so complete it was almost painful to witness. She wasn't property. She wasn't abandoned. She wasn't alone. When they stepped into the warm light near his home district, she finally whispered something against his shoulder, a word in her language, soft and fragile. Evan didn't know the translation, but the meaning was unmistakable from the way her markings glowed: gratitude, belonging, safety. Maybe even family. Humans were feared across the galaxy for their strength in battle, but few remembered their greatest weapon was devotion, the unbreakable promise that once a human chose to protect someone, Nothing in the stars would take that person away. Evan didn't take her home because she was helpless. He took her home because she deserved to live. And because humanity never abandoned those whom others threw to the cold.